What archetype of terror resides at the inescapable heart of the human condition, surpassing even the dreadful certainty of one's own temporary annihilation? It is the overwhelming silence that follows the last breath, the visceral enigma that looms over consciousness when it, stripped of its biological trappings, finds itself suddenly exposed before the vast and incomprehensible theater of eternity. An instant of supreme vulnerability where newly acquired freedom can be transmuted in a cosmic blink into the most abject and enduring of enslavements. This is not a mere exercise in esoteric speculation or a digression on the myths of the afterlife, but a surgical exploration of the cartography of the posthumous transition. According to the revelations codified by one of the most singular and prophetic minds of the 20th century, Edgar Cayce, the Virginia sleeper, whose vast work unveiled not only the mechanics of reincarnation and karmic causality, but crucially and often forgotten, the existential risk that lurks for the soul on the immediate threshold of physical death. I ask without hesitation, does the liberation of the body, that event which tradition promises as the glorious return to the source, contain an intrinsic danger, an ontological pitfall as subtle as it is devastating, capable of diverting the evolutionary course of a consciousness and condemning it to wander aimlessly in the shadows of the lower astral plane? The answer, according to Cayce's psychic readings, not only affirms the existence of this abyss, but identifies it with chilling precision, indicating that the fatal error most souls commit does not occur through malice or inherent ignorance, but through a reflex, an emotional atavism that, in the crucial moment, rejects the very transition, condemning the spirit to a spectral prison woven with the invisible threads of attachment and unresolved memory. We are about to descend into the architecture of that fleeting instant, the moment when eternity opens, and to understand why a fraction of a second of retrospective melancholy or undissolved bondage can be the origin of all the ghosts that populate our history and the cause of countless souls trapped between the silent echoes of what was and the unattainable promise of what must be. The perspective presented here does not seek easy consolation or the dogmatic reaffirmation of established creeds. Its purpose is far more ambitious and, at the same time, far more pragmatic, to provide the incarnate spirit with a navigational manual for the final and most transcendental of journeys, allowing the understanding of the mechanisms of the afterlife to become a lever for the active transformation of present life. It is imperative to transcend the popularized and simplistic view of the spirit ascending immediately to the light, for the transition, as Cayce describes it, is a delicate process, governed by implacable vibrational laws and susceptible to the emotional inertia accumulated during physical existence. If earthly life is the school, death is the final exam, and the soul must demonstrate that it has learned the fundamental lesson of detachment and inner sovereignty to avoid the phantom tether that irrevocably binds it to the space-time coordinates it has just left behind. Understanding this fatal error is empowering. It is understanding that the fear of death is nothing more than the fear of disorientation and unwanted anchoring, and that the only way to ensure a harmonious transition to the spheres of higher understanding is by actively preparing, while still bound to the flesh, by practicing the dissolution of those invisible chains, guilt, possessiveness, unprocessed despair, that act as energetic shackles at the moment of liberation. We will delve into the concept of earthbound, the state of trapped souls, analyzing how these entities, unable to accept their new dimensional reality, become the primary source of many of the paranormal phenomena that science ignores and superstition distorts. They manifest their anguish through cold spots or anomalous movements of objects, not because they are demonic or malevolent entities, but because they are profoundly disoriented consciousnesses, begging for the energy of the living to sustain the illusion of an existence that no longer belongs to them. The revelations that follow, drawn from the raw source of Cayce's readings, act as an encrypted map for initiates seeking the truth behind the curtain of the visible. We will explore the astral topography in 3 major transitional zones: the lower, dense and laden with collective projections; the middle, dedicated to the inescapable review of life and emotional balance; and the upper are, where peace and the understanding of oneness reside, unfolding how the quality of our emotions and the strength of our will throughout life inexorably dictate in which of these spheres the spirit will initially awaken. Understanding this metaphysical diagram is not mere intellectual curiosity. It is the very architecture of our posthumous evolution. We will examine with forensic precision the emotions that act as energetic anchors, identifying unforgiven guilt, residual fear, and possessiveness as the bars of the astral prison. But this journey does not end in despair. Rather, it leads us to the redeeming certainty that the state of captivity is not eternal, and liberation is always possible, whether through the compassionate assistance of spiritual guides who pierce the veils, or through the inner awakening of the soul that, finally exhausted by its resistance and denial, chooses to release the past and move toward the light inherent in its being. This teaching, due to its depth and rigor, demands unreserved dedication, an opening of consciousness that transcends the limits of what we think we know about ourselves and our ultimate destiny. Allow yourself to be not only a listener or reader, but an active witness to your own transcendence. We have thus reached the threshold of a knowledge that promises to redefine not only how we face death, but, infinitely more importantly, the urgency and purpose with which we approach each day of our embodied existence. If you are ready to confront the mechanics of transition, to dismantle the illusion of permanence, and to arm yourself with the wisdom necessary to ensure your conscious journey, I invite you to seal this pact of seeking. This knowledge, encoded and unveiled in these profound reflections, must not be a secret that stagnates in the reservoir of a few, but a torch that illuminates the path for many. Therefore, I implore you, with the solemnity this matter deserves, to pause for a moment the ceaseless wheel of the world, to secure your commitment to this path of light by clicking the subscription button, to share this teaching with kindred spirits who seek the hidden meaning of things, and, as a public and immutable testament to your deepest intention, to inscribe in the digital ether, with the firmness of a declaration of principles before the cosmos, the unmistakable and resonant phrase, "I seek the truth." So be it, and let the journey toward understanding the incomprehensible begin now. The precise instant the silver thread breaks, the culminating and dramatic moment of clinical death, is, from an energetic perspective and according to the meticulous descriptions drawn from Cayce's writings, an event that transcends mere biological cessation, configuring itself as an explosion of consciousness and a release as violent as it is euphoric, comparable to the release of pressure accumulated over an entire lifetime, where the spirit, usually constrained by the limitations and densities of the physical body, is suddenly projected outward with a speed and lightness that disorient with their own magnificence. This rupture of the somatic bond is experienced, initially, not as a loss or a trauma, but as the instantaneous removal of all pain, all friction, and all sensory limitation. It is the sensation of having shed a leaden suit that prevented flight, and the soul finds itself floating, luminous and weightless, in a dimension that, although coexisting with earthly reality, vibrates at an immediately higher frequency, a liminal zone where thought is action and intention is manifestation, which explains the reported initial euphoria, that sensation of perceptive omnipotence where the ethereal body, or energetic double, separates from the physical shell, remaining connected to it only by a tenuous cord, the legendary silver thread, which still maintains a certain magnetic connection during the first moments, providing the spirit with a dual consciousness, the perception of the astral world that opens up and the residual, but intense, awareness of the scene unfolding around the inert body, a duality that, although fascinating at first, soon becomes the source of initial confusion and the prelude to the great error. Consciousness is perceived as complete, unaltered, and identical to itself. But stripped of the need for the physical senses, vision becomes panoramic and three-dimensional, hearing extends to telepathic perception, and the being recognizes itself, at last, as a pure vibratory entity, a vortex of memory and experience, freed from the yoke of gravity and disease, a state that Cayce, if the soul could keep its focus upwards, would be the immediate step towards meeting its guides and ascending to the higher planes of existence. However, the inertia of matter and the habit of incarnation act as a powerful magnet. The euphoria of this liberation, however, is surprisingly ephemeral and is usually eclipsed by a profound and distressing disorientation that sets in almost immediately afterward, manifesting as a perceptual conflict that marks the beginning of the post-mortem ordeal. The soul, although free from the body, maintains such an intense vibratory link with the material plane that, out of habit and the inertia of attention, it tries to interact with its immediate environment using the psychic patterns developed during life, only to encounter a dense and total frustration, the subtle and devastating realization that it can no longer influence or be perceived by those left behind in the third dimension. This is the first shock of astral reality. The spirit sees the bereaved, hears their laments, observes the reactions of those who survive it, and, in a reflexive act of consolation or need for affirmation, tries to speak, tries to touch, or simply tries to manifest its presence and well-being. But its words are silent echoes that do not disturb the physical air. Its hands pass through matter, and its attempts at connection are received with the most absolute, painful, and immutable indifference by the living, who, anchored in their own vibratory frequency and limited by the density of their senses, are completely unaware of the spectral presence that floats beside them. This denial of interaction creates an unbearable existential paradox. The soul is fully conscious and present, yet functionally invisible and inaudible, a shadow in a world of lights that do not acknowledge its existence. This state, for a consciousness accustomed to the immediate response and emotional exchange of life, generates a profound sense of estrangement, loneliness, and, most dangerous of all, a radical doubt about its own continued existence, forcing it to look backward to the only reality its subconscious mind still validates: the inert body or lost affections, laying the groundwork for the attachment that Cayce identifies as the catastrophic error. The disorientation is exponentially exacerbated by the inertia of consciousness, a psychic phenomenon where habits, routines, and mental connections established over decades of incarnation act as a subtle yet powerful gravitational force, preventing the now free soul from immediately rising to its natural frequency and instead forcing it to remain orbiting the scene of its recent existence. This psychic inertia manifests in various ways, the most common being the spirit's lingering in the vicinity of its recently departed body or in familiar places, its home, its workplace, or the sites of its most intense affections. Out of habit rather than necessity, the spirit finds itself trapped in a time loop, attempting to continue the activities that defined its identity, turning on lights that won't light or opening doors that no longer offer resistance. According to Cayce, the need for a spatial reference point is so strong in less evolved souls in detachment that, even though the silver cord has completely disintegrated, leaving the spirit free of any physical anchor, it willfully remains close to density, desperately seeking the familiarity of what it knows, unable to accept the vastness of the astral plane that has opened before it. The paradox of this state is that, while the spirit has gained a lightness and agility that defy earthly laws, its own mind, limited by the constructs of time and space, chains it to a narrow radius of action, turning immense freedom into dimensional claustrophobia. It feels like a fish that has been released from an aquarium into an infinite ocean, but whose memory compels it to keep swimming within the glass walls that no longer exist. A phenomenon of psychological attachment that uses the residual energy of places and the emotions of the living as a precarious substitute for the vitality it has lost, perpetuating its illusion of physical presence. This lingering on the threshold, driven by inertia and the inability to accept the new vibrational reality, inevitably leads to the most tragic of observations: witnessing the pain and grief of loved ones without being able to intervene, an emotional ordeal that, according to Cayce's readings, acts as the primary catalyst for the fatal mistake. The soul, still saturated with human empathy and emotional bonds, observes its own funeral, perceives the intensity of its family's suffering, hears the words of love and promises of remembrance, and, in that moment of extreme emotional vulnerability and dimensional confusion, is driven to a desperate need for comfort or farewell that cannot be satisfied, as all its expression is ineffective and silent for the bereaved. It is at this point that attachment solidifies and the denial of death becomes critical. The spirit, seeing its own importance in the drama of the living, begins to feel a deep guilt for having abandoned them, or a possessive desire to remain close to alleviate their suffering, which generates a reversal of energy and a fixation of attention on density. The tragedy of this silent observation is not only the pain the soul feels upon seeing the suffering of others, but the growing fear that settles in its own consciousness upon perceiving its absolute powerlessness and invisibility. A feeling that directly contradicts the initial euphoria of liberation. This panic and guilt, not being processed and dissolved through the vibrational ascent, solidify like psychic chains, transforming love into a trap. The soul, instead of moving towards the light and peace offered by its guides, chooses, through a reflexive act of misunderstood sacrifice or possessive attachment, to turn its gaze towards the form it has just left, towards the tears of the living, anchoring its essence to a vibrational frequency compatible with the pain and emotional density of the earthly plane. An act of resistance to the transition that, ironically, condemns it to the state of earthbound, the wandering spectre. The turning point in this stage of separation, the moment of unconscious decision, occurs when, amidst the confusion and despair of invisibility, consciousness begins to perceive an opposing force, a subtle yet inescapable pull attempting to draw it upward, toward a non-physical light, toward a state of peace that stands in stark contrast to the melancholy of the earthly plane. This is the manifestation of spirit guides, teachers, and beings of light, often in the form of deceased relatives or friends who have previously ascended, whose mission is to intercept the disoriented soul at this threshold and remind it of its true destiny. These guides manifest at the frequency of unconditional love and understanding, using telepathy and the projection of peaceful and welcoming mental images to counteract earthly inertia and emotional anchoring. However, the effectiveness of this help is directly dependent on the level of detachment the soul cultivated in life. If the spirit is too absorbed by earthly drama or guilt over its departure, the guide's vibration may be perceived as distant noise, or even interpreted fearfully as a threat to the identity it tries to maintain close to its former home. Free will, even in death, remains the supreme law, and the soul must make the active, though often unconscious, decision to release its physical anchor and follow the light. The danger lies in the fact that by resisting the upward call and focusing on density, the soul commits the ultimate fatal error: attachment to the perishable. Looking back in an echo of Lot's wife's tragedy, where consciousness crystallizes at the frequency of nostalgia and denial, The crucial question looming over this moment is, why, despite immediate help and the promise of peace, do so many souls willingly choose the darkness of captivity, preferring the illusion of earthly presence to the truth of their own eternity? And what exact psychological mechanism transforms love and fear into unbreakable energetic chains? This leads us directly to an analysis of the act that Cayce identifies as the betrayal of one's own transcendence. The immediate cleavage of the biological shell is not a cessation, but an explosion, a sudden and dizzying expansion of the senses. It is the decompression of the diver, ascending from the abyssal depths into the sunlight. Consciousness, freed from the bony and neural yoke, experiences what the ancient Eleusinian priests called the lysis eterea, the dissolution of the bonds of inertia. There is an initial euphoria, yes, but not merely emotional. It is an ontological euphoria, the palpable realization that identity was not contained within putrescible and mortal matter, the chronic pain that tormented the nerve endings, the opacity of the dense senses, the implacable weight of earthly gravity, all evaporate in a glorious instant of supreme weightlessness. The soul feels, for the first time since its descent to the physical plane, its true vibratory architecture, fluid, iridescent, infinite, resonating with a melodic purity it had forgotten. It is a momentary return to the paradisiacal state of grace, a fleeting promise of the true nature of the eternal being. This moment of liberation is so absolute, so dazzling in its lightness, that the soul is often captivated by the simple beauty of its new, subtle vehicle, an energetic body that responds instantly to thought without the slow and clumsy muscular translation. Consciousness flashes, and the immediate environment, though still anchored to earthly resonance by the proximity of the bereaved, reveals itself with a prismatic clarity never before imagined, an overload of information that is initially overwhelming and glorious. It is an instant of regained sovereignty, where the mind believes it has effortlessly found perfection before the inertia of earthly habit and psychological conditioning begin to claim their inevitable and tragic toll. This euphoria, however, has a dramatic expiration date, a deadline imposed not by an external cosmic law, but by the very structure of the undissolved ego, for it crashes against the first great post-mortem paradox, the annulment of sensory reciprocity. The spirit, believing itself fully restored and more real than at any other moment of its physical existence, immediately attempts to interact with its recent past. It turns toward the deathbed, toward the bereaved, toward the familiar realm where life has ceased for it. It speaks. It observes the pain, the denial, and the dismay of those who survive it. And it awaits the response, the gesture of recognition that never comes, the comfort that cannot be given. Herein lies the seed of profound disorientation. The soul, though freed from physical density, remains a prisoner of the perceptual density of others. He realizes, with a chilling dread that is not physical but purely noetic, that his words, his movements, his vibratory presence pass through the consciousness of the living without leaving the slightest resonance. It is the discovery of invisibility not as a mystical superpower, but as a state of profound existential solitude. This disorientation is exacerbated by the phenomenon of the resonance echo. The familiar surroundings seem almost normal, but slightly distorted, like a painting seen through a veil of ethereal gauze or a parallel out-of-phase reality. The inability to be perceived acts like a broken mirror, reflecting back to the spirit a fragmented and diminished image of itself. The metaphysical truth is that the spirit has not become less real. It is the living who have become impenetrable to its subtle frequency. The pain of not being able to console, of not being able to explain their new freedom and existence, is the first chain forged on the subtle plane, marking the end of the initial lightness and the beginning of the forced anchoring process. the desperate attempt to force interaction, the inaudible cry that tears at the etheric throat. The phantom touch that doesn't disturb a single molecule of air in the bedroom catalyzes the transition from euphoria to acute frustration, often degenerating into impotent rage. In the forbidden texts of the Coptic Gnostic tradition, this is described as the clash of the first mirror, where the subtle will, accustomed to muscular mediation and physical reaction, impacts against the electromagnetic barrier of the dense world, like a wave crashing against a basalt cliff. The spirit attempts to move an object, perhaps a flower, a photograph, a lock of hair from the loved one. The will is pure, the intention is absolute, but the vibrational frequency lacks the specific weight to displace the matter it has left behind. This repeated failure generates what we call residual astral panic, a surge of negative energy that consumes the newly acquired light of liberation. Instead of rising and embracing ascension, the soul expends its precious, subtle energy on the futile task of making the intangible tangible, of regaining a sense of influence. This is the trap of sensory attachment. Proof of existence for the disoriented spirit still resides in the reaction and reflection of others. If the living do not see me, if my words have no echo, how do I know that I am still me, the me they loved, and that I myself recognized? This circular and toxic logic is what halts the upward flow, creating devastating energetic friction. The effort to break through the barrier is energetically futile. The energy dissipates in microwaves of resentment, sadness, or despair. And worse, it creates a dense vibrational signature around the soul, a low-frequency cocoon that makes the assistance of the guides or bridge builders, the so-called psychopompoi, even more difficult to penetrate. The soul is wrapping itself in its own shroud of incomprehension and rage due to the lack of communication. The crisis of inaction and invisibility inevitably leads to a devastating identity crisis. The spirit, which until recently was defined by its meticulously constructed earthly roles, parent, spouse, professional, sinner, saint, suddenly finds itself in an operational void where these titles lack functional or vibrational meaning. Disorientation is total because the scaffolding of the ego, built primarily on social recognition and physical interaction, collapses without external support. The soul, no longer reflected in the eyes or actions of the living, begins to doubt its own cohesion and continuity. Am I just a disembodied memory? The Tibetan Bardo Thodol describes this state as the Chonyid Bardo, the bardo of realization of reality, but in its lowest manifestation, where consciousness, instead of recognizing the clear projections of its mind as immanent truths, fears and repels them. Here, the great test is to release the memory of the self that once wore flesh, the perishable avatar. If the spirit stubbornly clings to the lingering pain of family, the financial worries of the mortgage, or possessive love, that energy of attachment acts like a subtle gravitational magnet, irrevocably anchoring it to the Earth's frequency, generating a self-imposed state of limbo. This anchoring is not physical or enforced by demons, but purely psychological and energetic. The soul begins to experience a distorted version of time and space in that intermediate plane. It may see echoes of past events or glimpses of the future related to its former home. But this clairvoyance is painful, for it underscores its current, utter powerlessness. The true disorientation is not geographical, but chronological and ontological. The spirit remains dangerously trapped between what was, the known matter, and what should be, eternal transcendence. As confusion deepens and frustration consumes the last vestiges of the initial euphoria, the soul unconsciously begins to construct its own temporary purgatory of waiting. This prison is not made of forged bars, but of unresolved thought patterns, denial of departure, and the residual weight of unreleased emotions. The inability to accept death, The fundamental denial of the law of perpetual cycle translates into a forced stay near the earthly plane, in what is esoterically called the lower mist, or the lower astral boundary, a sea of souls anchored by fear or desire. The spirit, without the guidance of the physical senses but still under the magnetic pull of its passions, interprets any external vibrational stimulus, changes in temperature, subtle noises, the presence of other anchored spirits or specters through the distorted filter of its recent trauma. Love that was not released becomes obsessive vigilance. The fear of poverty transforms into an obsession with the location of material possessions. This is the critical point where the initial separation solidifies into self-imposed captivity. The soul has failed the test of inertia, preferring the familiarity of earthly misery and the shadow of the known to the terrifying immensity of the eternal unknown. It is the transition from panic to paralysis. The next fundamental phase, the life review, the encounter with unveiled truth, cannot truly begin until this layer of denial and attachment is dispelled, either by the decisive intervention of higher guides, if the soul, even in its stubbornness, allows it, or by the slow, agonizing, and painful energetic dissolution of the illusion of earthly home. But before the spirit can submit to the impartial severity of its own review, it must first shed the last and most treacherous mask it still wears, the veil of self-justification. What subtle and perverse mechanism allows the soul, even in its ethereal state and aware of its error, to rewrite the narrative of its life? And how does this initial distortion affect the immaculate purity of the Akashic record that is about to be revealed to the spirit's inner gaze? Cayce's warning, distilled from the forbidden texts of Thoth and encoded in the simple biblical metaphor of Lot's wife, constitutes the fundamental noetic commandment for the passerby: you must not look back. This seemingly simple precept encapsulates the quintessence of the dynamics of immediate ascension. Looking back is not a mere sentimental act, but an ontological betrayal, a catastrophic reaffirmation of the material anchor that the spirit has just relinquished by cosmic decree. When the soul, freed from biological burden, directs its attention and, crucially, its desire toward the phenomenal substrate of the recently abandoned existence, be it the inert body, the tangible house, or the ethereal presence of a loved one, it reverses the direction of its energetic flow. In that instant of nostalgic or possessive hesitation, a parasitic connection crystallizes, a low-frequency spectral chord that acts as a hyperbolic ballast. This act of emotional return creates what the ancient Egyptians called the psychic sarcophagus, a self-imposed cocoon of dense ether. It is the refusal to accept the fertile void of non-being that freezes the disincorporation process. The promise of liberation transforms into a sentence of confinement in the lower layers of the astral plane, where the spirit remains suspended, neither fully alive nor completely transcended, observing the earthly drama through a window clouded by anguish and regret, condemned to be a mute witness to the dissolution of what it tried to hold on to. This soul has chosen the eternity of yesterday over the immensity of tomorrow, becoming an energetic relic, a pillar of salt, whose substance is petrified memory and unfulfilled desire. The mechanism of this phantom connection lies in the sustained resonance of the residual etheric body. After death, the subtle body, the etheric double, takes time to fully dissolve. If the spirit, the higher self, clings to this residue, it energizes it and keeps it cohesive. It is the vibrational equivalent of refusing to shed the chrysalis. Lot's wife did not linger out of intellectual curiosity, but out of a visceral attachment to the material corruption she had been commanded to abandon. Similarly, the spirit that looks back does so not out of pure love, but out of a toxic mix of possessiveness, fear of being forgotten, and a denial of its own relational finitude on earth. This egoic attachment prevents the complete withdrawal of the higher mind, the monad, and compels a portion of the soul, the lower self, or the recently deceased personality, to remain orbiting Earth's gravitational field, thus creating the entity known in esoteric tradition as the phantom, or spectre of desire. This spectre lacks the capacity for evolution. It simply reflects and repeats the emotional patterns and obsessions of its physical life, magnifying suffering by perceiving the world without the buffer of the physical body. It is an existence of unfulfilled need, of constant hunger for an interaction that is no longer possible. A self-constructed purgatory where the only activity is the sterile surveillance of a stage that no longer belongs to it, condemned to the energetic immobility that precedes true hell, slow and painful dissolution without having completed the revision. This post-mortem vigilance quickly becomes an unsustainable paradox. The trapped soul, unable to ascend, begins to expend its remaining subtle energy not on vibrational elevation, but on maintaining its tenuous psychic anchor. It attempts, with desperate fervor, to influence loved ones, warn them of dangers, or console their sorrows, but its attempts result, at best, in minor disturbances, cold, smells, whispers, and, at worst, in the emotional overload of the living, which paradoxically prolongs the suffering on both sides. The real danger lies in the fact that this self-imposed permanence negates the possibility of initiating the process of purification and karmic re-evaluation. The life review, the inescapable encounter with the absolute truth of one's own actions and motivations, demands pristine objectivity, an emotional emptiness free from the defenses of the newly extinguished ego. But the soul that looks back is actively defending the reality it has just lost. Their mind is preoccupied with justifying their past attachment and their present stasis. Therefore, the Akashic mirror cannot reflect the pure image. It is veiled by the fog of resistance and mourning for their physical existence. The spirit becomes its own jailer, denying itself the right to healing through the obstinacy of not letting go of the illusion of control over matter. The most serious consequence of this noetic anchoring is the initial distortion of the life record. If the soul persists in defending its earthly identity, surreptitiously rewriting the narrative of its failures, a self-defense mechanism that is strongest immediately after death, this distortion comes between the spirit and the book of life that is about to be opened to its inner perception. Clinging, attachment, functions as a filter of convenience. How could a spirit impartially judge the possessiveness or greed of its life if, at the precise moment of transition, it chooses the possessiveness of matter and the body over the freedom of the spirit? Lot's wife, by turning into salt, solidified in an affirmation of her identification with the life of Sodom and Gomorrah, choosing known corruption over unknown regeneration. It is the crystallization of the earthly self. For the soul, the pillar of salt is the inability to dissolve the egoic identity into the transcendent flow. This rigidity prevents access to the higher spheres of vibration, where truth is revealed without censorship. Total surrender, acceptance of physical oblivion, and temporary depersonalization is required for the soul to confront its karma. The spirit that refuses to look forward is condemned to relive again and again the self-justifying narrative of its final moments, trapped in a time loop of denial, unable to move forward toward meeting its guides and the inner tribunal of cosmic consciousness. Overcoming the fatal error requires an esoteric discipline practiced even in life, awareness of transience and loving detachment. Edgar Cayce emphasized that the only lasting and healthy connection is that of unconditional love freed from the need for possession. The soul must train for the moment of departure, knowing that the greatest act of love for those left behind is a swift and unrepentant departure. When attachment becomes a chain, the spirit falls into the trap of the intermediate plane, the Kama Loka, where dissolution can take subjective centuries, marked by overwhelming loneliness and the progressive loss of identity, until the energy of desire is extinguished by sheer vibrational starvation. It is a destiny that only the spirit's obstinate will can force. Resisting the natural law of ascension, guides may attempt rescue, but if the anchored spirit insists that its home is in the pain of earth and not in the light of origin, not even the cosmic hierarchy can compel release. The first test after death is the simplest and the most crucial, the unconditional acceptance of death itself. But if the spirit fails this test, what structures of deception and revisionism must it construct to justify its terrible error of stasis? And how does this self-constructed narrative mask the immaculate purity of the Akashic records before the inevitable confrontation? The spirit, forced into stillness by its own attachment, finds bitter solace in a preliminary review of its existence. But this review is not judgment, it is defense. How does the disembodied ego manage to shape memory, weaving the web of self-justification? And what dangers lurk when the soul prepares to see its life reflected, not for the first time, but through a prism of preconceived intentions? We have crossed the threshold, understanding the ultimate paradox. The soul's fatal error is not an imposed condemnation, but a sustained choice. It is the conscious denial of the law of return, the anchor of the ego that prefers the familiar shadow of earth to the unconditional light of origin. Death is not the judge, it is the mirror. Karma is not punishment, it is the inevitable resonance of intention. Final freedom is not earned, it is accepted. He who dies in peace, dies in truth, and his ascension is as instantaneous as his last breath. The time we fear losing here is the time we fear gaining there. Now I ask you, Artificer, if your conscience is your only judge in the moment of transition, what unfulfilled act of service or forgiveness could become your heaviest chain? The journey has only just begun. The truth that is revealed must be shared. If this knowledge has ignited a spark, it is your duty to light the torch for others. Decree expansion. Share this message with those who need it. Subscribe to secure your place in the community of light and activate the bell so that no portal closes before you without warning. Cayce's knowledge is vast, but now we must move on to the mechanics of return. I'll see you at the next portal. Prepare for the truth behind reincarnation. Why do we always return to the same place?